All right, everybody, welcome. My name is Sean Tufts, and I'm your host for today's session. Today's session is Cybersecurity in Space, Protecting Communications, Research, and Beyond. The marketing team killed my idea to call this To Infinity and Beyond. Apparently someone already owns that. But thank you very much for attending, and welcome to our presentation. First note, housekeeping. We do this on LinkedIn Live on purpose. Optiv's invested a lot in LinkedIn Live. It's where our community lives. Everybody we know from the cybersecurity community is here. It's meant to be interactive. First thing, we are all professionals. We are all experts, although no one is an expert, especially in cybersecurity and especially in the realm we're going to be talking through today, space. So there's no question too dumb. There's no question too fun to throw in the chat window. Pull them up, we'll read them. Again, meant to be interactive and meant to be a participatory event. All right, so our topic today, space and cybersecurity. I'd say from the invention of the telescope, the refract lens, everything we were doing from Galileo to now, humanity's always looked up and wondered, hey, what are those dots and how can we utilize them? How can we profit off them? How can we take advantage of them, from warfare to sailing to today's telecommunications? Space has always fascinated us, especially those in the technology community. Today, we're talking through that interconnection, that intersection of cybersecurity and how to make sure that these new operations and frontiers can be protected and also utilized. So for today, we've got two of our subject matter experts. We did have to sub out Mr. James Turgill. When the former CISO of the FBI says, hey, I have an urgent meeting, you listen and you just, thank you. So we're subbing in Nick Hyatt today. Nick is a seasoned veteran of incident response for us. He works in digital and malware forensics, threat hunting, and intelligence for Optiv's Global Cyber Threat Intelligence Center. Nick, you want to say hello?
Hey, thanks for having me on. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming. And we also have Nikki, which is a true challenge for a moderator. We're having a Nick and a Nikki, but we're going to push through it. Nikki is a retired colonel with the Army. She's a former intelligence officer and now directs our Optiv Federal Services for everything on the service side in our federal branch. Nikki has a vast experience in military intelligence and has acute understanding how militaries, governments, and enterprises can defend against cyber criminals. Nikki, thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Cool, so let's jump into it. I'm going to spend all parts of my power to not talk about UFOs and UAPs today. I'm sure everybody was logging in thinking, hey, maybe they'll cover that. I think we're going to push that to Reddit, a place where the conspiracy theories belong. But it is interesting. We are starting to utilize different components digitally for our life. So Nikki, if you could talk through what you see from a use case perspective on how individuals, how enterprises, how governments are utilizing space for digital communications.
Well, and just not just communications, right? I mean, we use it for weather forecasting. We use it for, navigation. We use it for satellite TV. We can't live without that, But the biggest thing is when you start thinking about, how do we do environmental monitoring? How do we do identify our missile warning? We can detect, nuclear detonation, any missile launches. That's how we safeguard our own borders and things like that. So those are just a few of those ways that we do to every single day.
Well, that's so interesting. I think of it just from a telecommunications and communication standpoint, but you're talking through weather predictions and you're talking through advanced military operations and getting intelligence faster.
Mm-hmm. That's correct. So, I mean, when you're normally thinking of, when you brought up space really quickly, right? So we're always trying to figure out how do we sense even deeper? How do we know and get the earliest warning possible, whether that's a national disaster about to happen or a man-made disaster. We try to identify as quickly as possible, and space is absolutely required to help us do that.
As I read the news, especially with a hurricane headed towards the Florida coast, right? When I think about some of our, some things happening in Ukraine, I'm now not happy unless I have an up-to-date image of that hurricane, of that cyber operation, or of that physical operation. If I don't have an immediate picture of that, I think the news is less valid. So that's another way.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Taking pictures in there. Just concerns of, how that how much early warning can we provide for our citizens, right, as they go out there? And that's not just here in the United States, because we are all over the globe, right? Whether our embassies are in different locations. So the earliest warning we provide our citizens, the safer we keep them.
And the military probably handles that in a much different way. My annoyance with a outdated picture on a satellite is nothing compared to what we would experience in actual kinetic warfare, right?
That's right. So we were kind of thinking about what was going on in the Ukraine, for example, right? So you had everything from satellite disruptions, jamming, of your navigation systems, to everyday communications, being able to shut down water and supplies over there. So these were all things to be paying attention to, and how quickly can we respond and react to getting those items back online, right? How did we do that? So not just that, but also spoofing, right? I mean, I think you've heard of, when they are doing that, give you an image that's not really there to throw you off. So the concerns that we have in there is, as they're getting to explore new and interesting ways of using them in a wartime scenario, we are at the same time now observing and supporting our allies, with our ability to sense deeper. And so again, space becomes critical. And we'll kind of go into, I think, later on to where I would call data is king, right?
Data is king, especially in kinetic warfare. I think that's probably a whole new avenue from the days in World War II when we were mocking up tanks to hide our location to D-Day to now. That's just as relevant now and actually moves faster at this point. Interesting.
Well, I think for me, the biggest thing that, when you think of strategic advantage, right? What is our country's strategic advantage? And I think you can actually watch this with the growing aggression of China and what it's trying to do in the seas, as well as what Russia's doing. And that is our ability to project and sustain power, right? So nobody does it better than the United States. However, that comes with its challenges, right? Its ability to be disrupted. And once that's disrupted, then we lose that strategic advantage. So what used to be considered air superiority that allows you to have conduct operations at a time and place of your choosing, not your enemy's choosing, but yours. Now you have to be able to dominate within the space and cyber, space. So you'll hear terms like, information dominance. We can't do that without cyber superiority. Right. So how do you achieve those things? And those are definitely challenges in which the military and the DoD and our federal government are having to work through.
Oh, such an interesting conversation. Wow. So we mentioned satellite technologies from a communication standpoint. And from the moment we put our first networked equipment online, there were people probing those ports, trying to take advantage of any vulnerabilities they can find. Nick, question for you. We are now opening up a new sphere. Finding those ways to protect things is now a different challenge. Right from the news we had last month, Viasat had an attack. Their satellite communications company had a big DDoS campaign launched against them. What did we learn from that?
That was a situation where a theoretical attack vector became real, right? So given the situation in Ukraine where there's an ongoing war, and as Nikki explained, it's not just the kinetic battle space anymore. It's even expanding into the cyber battle space. And this attack was really interesting because what they did is they exploited a misconfiguration of VPN appliance that allowed them to gain remote access to the management segment of the network. And so what they were able to do there is actually shut down that communication between the terrestrial modems and the satellite, straight up just disrupting that network. In this case, recovery was pretty straightforward. It was a factory reset on the modems and then, shipping replacement devices to those areas that weren't able to get over-the-air updates. As I'm sure you're familiar with some, IT and OT spaces, not everything is going to be easily accessible, especially if it's air-gapped. So in this case, recovery was fairly simple, but that might not be the future when we're talking about these attacks, because we're still in the infancy of what can happen here. And just recently, today, actually, because of the hurricane, the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office, their launch of the Silent Barker satellite was pushed back a little bit. And that actual satellite communication array is designed for space monitoring. So we have the capability to look up and see these things, but we also need to have the capability to look at those spaces while we're actually out there. And so that mission is designed to give us that foothold, that information dominance, as Nikki so aptly put it, for that space.
All right, you used the term air gap, one near and dear to my heart. Air gap, I think we saw it with mobile devices, then we saw it with IoT devices. Now I feel like we're entering into a new sphere with satellite communication gear and everything else we have floating above us. I always think that new systems are air gapped by nature because it's something different we haven't seen before. But these things are just living as close to the corporate network or providing that backbone than I think we give credit for, right?
Yeah, that's true. And it's interesting that we even talk about air gapping, because I don't think you can air gap a satellite, right? You have to be able to talk to it. So that provides that extra level of difficulty when you're thinking about securing that. Very much so, because how do you secure that communications platform? Whether that be physical security in terms of, biometric restrictions, things like that. But again, because this is such a new frontier, we're having these explorations of what does securing a satellite look like, and what do those capabilities involve?
Yeah, and it's not, oh, just turn it off, we'll hot swap it and put a new server blade in. That has a whole new dynamic when you start talking about something going at 70,000 feet above the Earth's surface, right?
Exactly. And hot swap a new server blade in. You can't exactly hot swap something into a geostationary orbit, right? You have to have the launch planning, and there's so many moving parts there. And then when you're thinking about, secure software development, even, how are you protecting the launch vehicles for these things? Because when you're looking at satellites and looking at these communications, it's just as easy to attack that supply chain as it would be to directly attack the satellite. So that's also a consideration to think of. And it's this new frontier where it's not as easy as just saying this environment is restricted access, completely offline, because you have to have that communications capability. So there are definite considerations there when going to secure these things.
So I think I'm just to add something real quick on that, Sean, because I think when you're thinking about that, right, two big components come into that. The ability to, when I brought up projecting and sustaining power, right, that's a huge thing about the supply chain. The other part of it is how it impacts any modernization efforts, right? So every time we're preparing to launch or we're doing anything to modernize our capabilities, how are you ensuring you are delivering that capability up front uncompromised, right? And being able to identify those things that could potentially be in the system before you even launch it. So those are where, that becomes a difficulty, but cybersecurity has to be thought of upfront before anything. I mean, you don't want to launch it and then go, oh, we just now have to launch again. So one, that's costs American taxpayers money, but additionally, it's worthless. It's junk flying up there. And it goes back into that situational awareness piece, right, that I brought up earlier. And to be able to do all the things we're talking about, you have to have the ability to see, okay, and have that situational awareness out there, and what your battlefield is. And that we struggle right now that you have multiple domains, before air, sea, land, right? Now you had space and you add cyber to that. How do you have situational awareness of what's going on within that space, whether it's in a commercial space or it's in a military space? You have to be able to see that. And currently, we struggle with the ability to do that, both from a policy standpoint, because all authorities reside at the national level, okay? And then the airspace resides at the operational level. So there's a conflict right there, and that reduces agility. So now you have a time span that creates issues for you.
Yeah, we had a question come in from the chat window. It says, how secure are satellites? And I think that goes to a wide range. Number one, I think we've got a lot of hardware already up in the sky. Number one, that wasn't done with best security practices front of mind. And number two, walking what Nikki was just talking about, mature SDLC processes, mature builds. Those pieces and parts are all I think, a challenge. And the issue you just hit on was budgets and time. It takes a long time to build these things secure.
But I think there's a parallel there, because if you look at major software implementations, major hardware implementations, things like that, these are not done spur of the moment, right? There's years of planning that are put into, even just basic lift and shift in an environment. And so I think some of that mindset can also be applied to space operations, largely because these are not planned spur of the moment, right? You're not saying, oh, we need to launch next week, let's go ahead and build this satellite. All of that development is done years in advance and things like that. So with a proper mindset of, let's make sure encryption's in place, let's make sure that we have proper authentication protocols, proper redundancy and backup systems. Because if we're looking at this and we can say, oh, well, if this attacker can do X thing to this satellite, then what redundancy can we put into that to say, let's do something else to make sure that we can offset that?
Yeah, so early in that modernization effort, right? That's a key vulnerability time, because there's a reason right now today that the Chinese have their J-20 that looks very similar to our F-22 and our F-35, right? That data, theft, right? So understanding, where they need to create their own time and space, they're coming after you. So if you think of what you were just talking about, Nick, and thinking of defense in depth, or some will use defense forward type of thinking, but that's an offensive mindset to do defense, right? And so therefore, I think you need to start thinking about like how we are training our talent so that they can think like that hacker, that and not just the hacker itself that's trying to steal for monetary purposes, but for national security gains, right? So what does that look like, and how do we bring that nexus of commercial and DoD or federal together to go after this, things that you see that the CISA has been working really hard on, but yet this is a big struggle for us.
Yeah, so you open the door there. How does our military leaders look at approaching this topic? They're already approaching it. We're already here. We're already in. So I guess I'll separate that into like, hey, what are the fundamentals? We've talked a little bit about it, but being more specific. Secondly, what are they thinking from the future? When Nick said encryption, I wasn't even thinking about encryption, right? I was thinking, it's up there. We don't need to encrypt it. It's far away. But eventually that device will land. And what went through my head was somebody leaving a space station in a suit and grabbing a satellite and plugging into a USB. How do our military leaders think about that today and then also in the future?
Well, I think right now, in its modernization efforts, right? What are we doing to ensure that we have what I brought up earlier, the ability to project and sustain power, our ability to dominate a space, our domain? Those are the things that are going to be critical foundational elements to our ability to secure our national interests, right? So in their thinking, anything that we modernize, anything that we work on, how do we secure it from the very beginning? Because, by the way, scientists love to go to conferences and they love to chat about what they're working on. And they, so how are you securing those things? Because right now, intellectual property is our number one, I would say we live in that space as far as the ability to create and develop new technologies and things like that. So why pay for it if you can just steal it, right? So that has to be first. That's where we have to be thinking of how we're securing those things. And when I was the G2 for Army Futures Command, I told my boss that the supply chain was his battlefield, from ideation to delivery. Okay, within that space, he needed to understand how the enemy and our adversaries and our competitors are operating within that space, and what's the most important. Understanding those gaps, that technology framework that that they're trying to identify their own gaps and what they're going to come after. So you can't secure everything. That's why defense in depth to me is intriguing, because you're trying to create layers to either push them off somewhere else, prevent them from getting in. But right now, I think that is not yet perfected. I mean, I think we do some things to create the resilience necessary for those networks to be protected. But again, it goes back to data being king. That's the most important thing. And that should be the primary focus of our ability to protect our national security.
Well, there's a lot of ways that question could anticipate intellectual property being the key element there. That's so fascinating.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think so much of what we do.
I don't know, Nick, if you had something. Yeah, go ahead.
Yep, go ahead, Nick.
No, I was just, I mean, if you think about it, though, it is, like I said earlier, that, there are things that, the theft of our IP, we dominated for so many years with, I think it was the SR-71. We kept that a secret for forever, or is it 117? I can't remember which, but it was like that stayed a secret for, 20, 30 years. We struggle with that, right? And that's because they're able to lay inside of our systems. And Nick, you'll probably remember this better than me, but there was a Chinese malware that had been in our system for over 10 years. And the only reason we discovered it, right, is because our anomaly detection had improved, not because it did anything to, alert us any different than it had been doing for those 10 years, right? But think about how much intellectual property and how much cost that was to anything that we build on from there, right? That they just saved. And that is the cheapest way to attack the United States, is through cyber.
Yeah, and it's not just the intellectual property theft, and I'm not trying to dissuade from that, but also, up here in Michigan, we just went through a series of really powerful storms that knocked out power to a couple 100,000 people. And so with power and internet being down, a lot of us were relying on mobile networks and satellite networks and things like that. And there is also the disruption to your way of life. And
that's right.
We saw that with the Viasat hacks. So there is also that element of, okay, maybe we don't steal intellectual property, but maybe we cause, a satellite blackout in major metropolitan areas to disrupt, local proceedings. And hey, maybe we cause that satellite blackout during an election cycle. And there's your offensive capability, because where do people get a lot of their news is from going to be your cable news. And it's not just terrestrial cable. It's also satellite cable, DirecTV, Dish, things like that. So there's also that aspect of it to think about.
Well, Nick, you brought up a huge point there, right? Just think of the positioning, navigation, and timing disruption potential, right? Out there in the seas or in the air, right? What does that do to us, to ability to project and sustain power? What, as I brought up earlier, is our number one, strategic advantage. So from a military standpoint, I think those are multiple attacks that would happen, that you disrupt, near ports, you disrupt, civilization, as, and how those things distract from other events that are happening. So I completely agree with you.
Cool. So let's shift into proactive tactics. Just off the heels of DEF CON, there was a satellite launched that was made to be hacked. Do you want to, Nick? You saw some of this and was a part of some of that. What are your takes on how can the good guys be more proactive here by utilizing things like bug bounty programs on satellites?
No, exactly. And I think proactive is probably the correct term for this, largely because, as we've established, this is still an unexplored front. So this Project Moonlighter, for those that don't know, is a satellite that was launched into space with the express purpose of being a test platform for hacking. How would an attacker approach getting into a satellite? And so there were several teams all competing for a large prize. And if you're interested in finding out more about this, DEF CON actually just posted quite a few videos about the Hack-A-Sat project. But being proactive is important. And one of the things that I do in my role here from an intelligence standpoint is help companies be proactive rather than reactive. It's both that offensive mindset, that proactive mindset. How do we get ahead of these things? And when we're talking about satellites, we're not just talking about the actual, orbiting body in space, but also those ground control centers. How are we securing those? And that's going to be your employee training, things like that. So you see something, say something. When I worked for a power company, we very much had that thing where if you're driving by one of our power stations and something doesn't look right, call the security center, right? Say, get somebody out there that knows what's important to look at that. And then again, your redundancy, your backup systems, your physical security. and just having those precautions and procedures, understanding your threat profile, so understanding where things exist. So yeah, we have this in geostationary orbit. Great, we've got all of these centers spread out around the country. What's going on from a political stance in those areas in the country that maybe we need to worry about? So are there going to be protests? Are we going to have to increase security in there? And then again, like, how is our network secured at those places? Do we have proper Wi-Fi security and things like that? Do we have people posted out there, especially in emergencies? So if there is a weather emergency and we need to have somebody on site to make sure that, you know, nothing is going to happen while the power's out and all of our gates are down and things like that, there are a lot of considerations to take into place. But really, the project at DEF CON is mostly to see understanding how attackers approach these problems and really what we can do to secure them. Not sure. Maybe we lost Sean.
Oh. I think, Nick, you brought some really great points on there as you start thinking about how, you know, that goes back to that nexus of civilian, federal, you know, public versus private, right? How do we actually understand how to take care of creating a resiliency within our systems, but additionally, though, how do we react to an attack, right? How do we get back on track through sharing of information and things that happen, you know, as quickly as possible? So the lessons learned from your thought process, what are you thinking about lessons learned from that, you know, that we're going to glean from that satellite launch?
Yeah, so I think this is part of a larger discussion, right? Because the space program is not new, but cybersecurity in the space program is new. And some of these satellites and some of these technologies are 20 and 30 years old. And, you know, a lot of this wasn't developed, I think, as you said earlier, wasn't developed with cybersecurity in mind. So part of the lessons learned here is that moving forward, you can have that secure development cycle. So if you have the right people in place, you can say, listen, we saw the work that you did hacking these satellites. Let's bring you on as an advisor, you know, and then say, here's what we are trying to do. If you were a adversary and wanted to stop us from doing that, how would you do that? And then, you know, throw ideas out there, because as we've seen in this industry, nothing is out of bounds. I mean, there are some wild ways that people will try to get into stuff. You see that right now with autonomous vehicles and things like that, the different attacks that are being put on there. So I think really when we're talking about developing, you know, secure ground stations, secure firmwares, things like that, it's going to be something that's part of the project planning process. So integrating that security into the whole aspect of it and saying, all right, we haven't updated these ideas in years and years. How do we do this moving forward? And that's what I think part of this project helps with, is get those new techniques, those refreshed ideas, get out of the suit and tie laboratory development, you know, the stodgy ways of doing things, and start throwing stuff at the wall and seeing if it sticks, and then learning how to defend against that.
So Nick, I just have to hit on one thing that you just said, which is so critical. It's not just about technology, right? It's about people and the mindset that they must have to go forward. So I think that was really key. That's what I pulled out of that, what you just said to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that we all understand as security practitioners is that at the core of it, it's a people issue. And so how do we approach these security problems while also considering that people are involved and maybe they don't care about security, right? It's not their job. But how do we make it so that we can ensure the security of these devices, of these satellites, of these ground stations, without making it an interruption to somebody's workflow? Because as you said, scientists love to go to conferences and talk about what they're working on. Scientists don't love to have security guys pop up and say, oh, you can't do that, that's insecure, when they're just trying to solve a problem, right? So how do we integrate those two and make it so that we can solve problems and keep, you know, our information dominance in place, but practice security as we should?
That's right.
So ironically, my internet feed dropped. I do use an internet service provider. I have another window open that is r/the company name, trying to figure out how latency could be solved. So ironically, we saw a use case almost perfect. A question came in that I think is really interesting on the back end of this, because it's talking, and we mentioned earlier, there's a lot of legacy items in space that are keeping up our infrastructure. When you launch a satellite, it has a longer shelf life than your corporate issued laptop, things like that. So the question came in with, there's an interesting study out of Germany, we haven't read that yet, on how insecure firmware is on existing satellites, allowing the takeover and redirecting and disabling of existing satellites. Boy, there's a lot to unpack in that. Nick, do you have any input on how we can secure our current fleet?
Well, I'll tell you, if I had the answer to that, I probably wouldn't be on this discussion. But just from a conceptual standpoint, it's more dealing with what happens when something happens here.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of what these missions like the Silent Barker mission are designed to do. What a lot of people don't realize is that there is a lot of activity in space between states where we're observing satellites and they're observing satellites right back. I mean, there have been documented instances where Chinese satellites have moved orbits to get closer to ours to monitor those communications. Do we know what their actual intent were? Probably not, but we can get a good idea of it based on our understanding of these things. So when we talk about securing older hardware and things like that, outside of astronomically expensive spacewalks to replace parts on these things, which may not even be feasible, largely because if it's just a standard communications satellite, do we want to spend that kind of money? I think more what it's going to be is there anything that we can do from a software standpoint? So if we're sending updates to these, can we do some code updates, things like that, to mitigate some of these attacks? And this circles back to that Moonlighter project, where as we start understanding how attackers will approach these sorts of things, can we retroactively apply some fixes there? And in some cases, maybe we can't. But you know what? We're still sending commands to the Voyager spacecraft, and they're billions and billions of miles away. So we could probably figure out a way to do it.
So interesting. And I think to shift it back to the national defense component, we talk a lot in cyber about what is an act of war, right? Like attacking electric grids is actually down, and those threat actors have moved on to manufacturing targets in a big way. Nikki, do you have any input, given that what we're talking about is actually off our dirt, on what would constitute away from kind of cyber fair play gamesmanship to a full-fledged act of war?
That's right. So that's a good debate that is happening, pretty continuously. I think it was in England held a huge conference with I can't remember the exact number of nations, but to actually have that conversation. What are we going to say as a declaration of war? And the initial thought was, of course, when you're disrupting, you shut down a power grid, that's disrupting. That's supposed to be considered an act of war. Do we continually move that line? I think we have a couple times. Because we're still trying to figure out, what does that look like in there? I think that also goes back to some fundamental problems that we have, though. The ability to actually visualize in our head and understand that this is not Minority Report. This is not, things of the futuristic. But how, when I explain attacks or things like that to, our maneuver folks within the military, they always want a picture. They want to be able to see it. So how do we, I think, help them visualize, what that battle space actually looks like, and be able to see it in a way that makes sense to the average person, right? And right now it doesn't. It just seems, if you can't see it, feel it, touch it, it doesn't feel real until it happens. And so I feel like that also creates some of the delays that we have and how we respond and how we think about it from a nationalist perspective, because I feel like some of our policymakers may not quite really have a good grasp of what these are, and so then we haven't made those decisions yet. So, but when you take down the pipeline, has happened again, that was supposed to be considered an act of war, right? But you're seeing insurance companies now telling folks, right, if it's a nation state, we're not paying. You know how hard that is to find that smoking gun that said that was a nation state. So I'm not really sure how that's going to work out for the insurance industry, but that is really hard to do. And I think because again, you can't, you don't have something physical, sometimes intangible. Not everybody understands it. So how do you have the same forensic response to a shooting, like a bullet, right? That you can see the ridges on it and you know what gun it came from. How do you now do the same thing? And I think that's, some of the things that we have to think through as we educate, the masses, so to speak.
And
especially those who are making decisions.
Yeah, and I want to expand on that idea a little bit, because at its core, whether you're securing a computer or a satellite or a power station, the fundamentals are all the same, right? You understand your environment, and you do some basic things. We're talking about, again, bringing up encryption, having those encrypted communications where it's not just a radio beacon, but it's an encrypted signal. That end-to-end security. So not only do you have encryption on the signal going to the satellite, but you also have encryption, at the operator's desk, things like that. Again, since we're talking about pie in the sky, brand new things, how do you integrate machine learning into this? And what can you do to enhance the capability of your responders to deal with things that they may not have ever seen before? And then resiliency in your systems design. I mean, again, these are the basics that apply to all kinds of security applications, but realistically, a satellite is just another computer. It's just 22,000 miles away. So what do you do? There's your remote worker, right? How are you securing your remote workers now? How do you secure that satellite that's 22,000 miles away? VPN and an EDR product. Good. Launch it. Let's go.
I can only think of the cloud is someone else's computer debate happening once you leave Earth. Now we're in a whole nother sphere. Boy, you brought something up too, and I think back to SolarWinds, the aspect you just described around best practices and fundamentals. There's a big ecosystem here, though. Every satellite at some point relies on its neighbor, and the ecosystem play gets harder and exponentially more important as we start growing out this ecosystem. How do we assure that? I mean, the government can legislate some standards and regulations there, and companies can opt into doing best practices, but somewhere in between, we have to have a little more force. Nikki, have you seen anything in that vein that would help us as practitioners?
So I think, I think we use a lot of terms, zero trust. We use terms like defense in depth, but being able to practice those things there. I do like to kind of think of it as how are you creating those multiple layers. But I think personally, if the boss is not doesn't have good understanding, so if a CEO or I'll say the commander, nothing happens unless they have buy-in and understand it and ensure that it happens, right? So that's where you actually have to start, that education, that understanding. It's not just the CISO, it's not just the CIO that are responsible for that. The CEO or the commander, they're responsible. And so therefore it is, up to them to kind of, one, identify what it is that we need to protect, right? What's the most important things? You can't protect everything. So, why waste your money to do so? But, make sure that you are protecting those things that you hold dear. So what does that look like? But that has to start with the CEO and the commander. As simple as that.
Boy, a question came in right as we were talking about that. The question is, how easy is it to track and target individual satellites for interfering with normal functions? Speaking of the ecosystem play, wow, I can only think of the snort rule that it would take to target a rogue threat satellite. And that's a really conceptually difficult question. Nick, you laughed probably too hard, so I'm going to go to you first.
So
I think that's not settled, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say is that, that's a kind of a gotcha of a question, because I think a lot of that information is classified, right? So how easy is it for us to track stuff? Well, we can track, foreign state satellites that have changed orbits to, interfere with our satellites. So that capability is there. You know, how capable that is not something that I'm privy to. But I'm sure that there are folks in, you know, the Space Force that would be happy to talk about that, you know, provided that you aren't a foreign agent or anything of that nature. But it's another problem to solve, right? I think as we start seeing a lot of these civilian companies getting into the space, you know, area and starting to launch satellites to do things of their own, that's going to be a problem that needs to be addressed. And you know, I'm waiting for the next block of startups to come out that, you know, have you harness your machine learning to track your space debris, as it were. So
the first as a service acronym I see from the space environment is going to be a pleasant one. I think that'll be fun.
Is SaaS, software as a service, or space as a service? What are we doing here? So
no, we got collision. Now we can't use it at all. Shoot. Cool. Well, we're wrapping up on our time here. Nikki, do you have any other closing thoughts on the governmental approach to this security problem?
No, I think we've had a pretty good discussion there, you know, and again, it was a privilege really to listen to Nick. I also learned a lot just listening to him myself. But no, I just think that the more that you can educate yourself on just as an individual, the better we're all going to be.
Well, the one word we didn't say was public-private partnerships, which I think is going to have.
Oh, I said it several times, Sean.
Oh, you did? Well, that's what
I did. You must have been zoned right out. I was when your internet was down. That it's huge, right? I mean, that is the nexus right there, and the place that's most exploited, by the way. So that's the scene.
Well,
as we go forward. So
cool. Well, thank you all for participating and sharing your thoughts today. We do have the Q&A section will continue to roll. We get those responses after, and will and can respond back. So if there's a question you got in the last couple seconds here, throw that in the chat window, and we'll do our best to. And thank you all for attending. And yeah, we've got these happening as often as we can put them out. So thank you for attending. And yeah, and for your future participation in the public-private partnerships that will be coming down the pipe in the next 10 to 15 years. So, thank you all.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks.